We'll give folks a few minutes to hop on. It is a very busy time of year, so I know we might have a few folks kind of hopping off and on, but appreciate you all taking the time today. We'll give people a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Hey, Keith, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
See, I see a few of our panelists hopping on. That's great. Awesome. It's great to see everybody. Great. And can I see your note? Thank you. Glad you could join us. Hillary, what do you think? Should we get started or give it a couple more minutes?
Looks like we might be waiting on a few last panelists, so I don't know if we want to give it one more minute and then get started, and hopefully everyone will be here by the time we reach the panel.
Sounds great. Thanks, Dan. I think there's a few people who might have to jump off and on as we work our way through the agenda, so no worries. Thank you. Great. Thanks to all of our panelists for taking the time to join today. Looking forward to that conversation. All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? And if other folks hop on as we go along, that will be great. But we have a pretty packed agenda, so I don't want to wait too long. So welcome everyone. It is great to see many of you here. This is the first Climate Council meeting of 2026. So looking forward today to kicking off the work. My name is Sarah Curran. I am Director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future and co-chair of the Maine Climate Council. And Melanie Loisem, Commissioner of Maine DEP, and our other co-chair is going to be joining us shortly. Over the past year, we spent a lot of time in our Climate Council meetings tracking the changes happening on climate policy at the federal level, and discussing what those changes mean for us here in Maine. And there is no doubt that we are operating in a different environment than when we planned and released the update to Maine Won't Wait in 2024. It's not just the federal changes to climate policy, including the repeal of funding, program uncertainty, and the rollback of longstanding environmental regulations that are affecting our implementation landscape. We are also seeing rising costs across the board, driven by tariffs, persistent inflation, and broader economic changes. And in recent weeks, the conflict in Iran has driven household heating fuel and transportation costs for families even higher. And all of this is shaping the implementation of Maine Won't Wait and what that will look like in 2026. It's going to influence both the pace and the path of our work as we look at the year ahead. And so today we wanted to take a step back from sharing updates on policies and programs and spend some time looking at how the issues of affordability and rising costs of living are showing up across Maine and in the day-to-day implementation work of Maine Won't Wait. So ahead of this meeting, we asked council members and working group co-chairs to complete a short survey to help us take stock of where implementation is moving forward, where bottlenecks are emerging, and where we may need to focus our attention in the year ahead. And so we're going to start the meeting today by sharing some of the themes from that survey. And thank you to those who were able to complete that. We really appreciate it. We'll also have a panel today focused on how affordability and climate are showing up in people's everyday lives. So areas like housing, energy costs, public health, transportation, working lands, and the marine industry. And as our landscape for implementation becomes more challenging, how we communicate about climate action remains critical to making progress. And we're excited to have Keith Carson from Maine Conservation Voters here today to talk about what it means to reach Mainers in this moment and how we can build greater understanding and participation as implementation continues. So the conversations we're going to have today will help set us up for the rest of the year. The June meeting will be a really important moment for the council. We'll be at the end of the fiscal year, the start of the annual reporting process, and roughly at the midpoint of implementing the 2024 Climate Action Plan. So that combination makes it a natural time to reflect on where we are and where we want to lean in over the next 2 years of implementation. So part of what we're going to do today is begin to identify areas where deeper focus, coordination, or new ideas could help strengthen our work and remove barriers as we move forward. While our plans are still taking shape for the second half of the year, in September, we plan to have a meeting fully focused on funding and financing of climate action. And in December, we'll review the 2026 annual report and the progress we've made over the last year, as we usually do. So to begin our meeting today, we wanted to start with the pulse check from the Maine Climate Council and the working group co-chairs on how implementation of Maine Won't Wait is progressing. In particular, we wanted to hear from you about where implementation is moving forward, where it may be running into challenges, and what topics should shape the council and working group priorities in the coming year. We circulated a short survey with 6 questions. We received 17 responses. All of the responses were anonymous, and for the open-ended questions, we've summarized the key themes that we've heard. So we're going to walk through the responses to those questions now. The first question focused on where we're seeing the most meaningful progress. Respondents could select up to 3 areas, and the top responses were buildings and energy efficiency, community resilience, and infrastructure resilience. Several respondents also highlighted progress in transportation and in clean and renewable energy. In the second question, we asked where challenges are growing, and unsurprisingly, rising costs and affordability pressures and federal policy uncertainty rose to the top, followed closely by funding and finance. Today's conversation is going to focus on affordability, and our September meeting will dive more deeply into funding and financing. So looking forward to those conversations, and we will also continue to keep the council updated on federal changes that affect the implementation of Maine Won't Wait. Climate-related changes are showing up in people's everyday lives, and the places where respondents said they're seeing these impacts the most are in energy and heating costs, in housing costs, and in infrastructure and storm impacts. And we'll share these a PDF of these slides afterwards, so you'll have a chance to look more closely at them. Another question focused on engagement in climate action, and two main themes emerged. First, respondents to the survey said that climate action remains concentrated among state and local government, nonprofits, and advocates, people whose work is already connected to policy, energy, transportation, or environmental issues. Second, they said that the broader public can be harder to reach. Climate action can feel abstract, and economic pressures, political beliefs, or a lack of direct connection can limit engagement. And we're going to return to this topic later in the meeting during our discussion with Keith Carson on climate communications. As we noted earlier, implementation is becoming more challenging. We are operating in a very different landscape than when the 2024 update was developed. Survey responses reflected both concerns as well as reasons for confidence. There is significant federal uncertainty, and several respondents raised questions about how the upcoming state elections could also affect continued commitment to climate action. At the same time, there are strong reasons for confidence. Maine has built a solid foundation for this work. Climate planning and the council's work are embedded in statute, and we've made meaningful progress in building both state and municipal capacity over the last several years. Respondents also pointed to rising energy demand and global instability as drivers of energy costs, with inflation continuing to slow adoption of some solutions. Despite this, the public, private, and nonprofit sectors are continuing to invest, and we're seeing more practical, on-the-ground solutions that address everyday concerns while also reducing emissions and building resilience. The growing awareness and tangible progress can help us sustain momentum even in a challenging environment. And then finally, we asked working group co-chairs and climate council members what climate-related issues may not be getting enough attention, and four themes emerged. First, while flooding and extreme weather receive a lot of attention, respondents noted less focus on slow-moving but significant changes, like warming winters, freeze-thaw cycles, drought, biodiversity loss, and invasive species. Second, while affordability is being discussed, respondents said there is a need to stay laser focused on cost of living and to better communicate the financial benefits of climate action. Third, respondents highlighted system-level barriers that often get overlooked, such as financing challenges, permitting, supply chain constraints, and growing energy demand. And finally, many noted that different communities have different needs and capacities, and a one-size-fits-all approach does not work across the state. So we wanted to share the responses that we received and also take a few minutes to see if folks had either additional thoughts or insights. It's okay if you didn't have a chance to respond to the survey. This is a great chance to chime in now, or if you did respond and you sort of have reflections based on hearing what other people had to say. Just wanted to take a few minutes right now and see if folks had additional thoughts on the questions in the survey.
Sarah, I'll confess I did not have a chance to fill out the survey. So apologies for that. But I think, a lot of what I see here is very relevant to some of the challenges that we are seeing with the natural and working lands recommendations, just funding being uncertain and or having gone away in places where we thought it was going to be where we were going to be able to advance some work. But at the same time, we've still been able to, I think, keep moving forward in important ways around our land conservation goals and other, programmatic efforts we're making around agriculture and forestry, and we're finding other ways. So that's what we do, and that's what we'll keep doing.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. That's really helpful. Other working group co-chairs or climate counselors want to chime in with either reflections on what you heard or responses that you provided in the survey?
Sarah, this is Judy. I can't find the raise hand or the camera. I don't know why that's happening to me today, but I'll try. There they are. Could you go back to the slide right before this? So, the giving confidence part, maybe it's just because this is the stuff that I love to do the most, but I'm just finding that the collaborations across state agencies and with the partners, especially because of the NOAA grant, but also the forming of the State Resilience Office, and then the collaborations with federal partners. I'm thinking of the inland flooding interagency working group, the out of harm's way community of practice. There are several really strong working groups that are not necessarily the working groups of the Climate Council, but that have grown out of this work that I think are advancing the implementation in really slow and deliberate ways. So that just makes my day by day. And I think it's something to really highlight. So I just want to say that.
Great. Thank you, Judy. I appreciate you sharing that. Any other comments about what you heard in the survey? Or what you would have said if you'd answered the questions?
Sarah, I have my hand up. I'm not sure
Oh,
if you
thanks,
could.
Ivan.
No,
I
that's
couldn't see
fine.
it.
That's fine. Um, could you go back to the slide we were just on? Yeah, that one. So I guess I feel compelled to just say that in the moment that we're in, when I read this question about things not getting enough attention, I think we're in a period of time where a lot of things fall into this category because the news cycle is filled with so much stuff, and most of it has indirect relationships to a changing climate. But nevertheless, climate as a storyline, both the good and the bad, has kind of been pushed out, as well as in trepidation of making some activity a target because it's focusing on climate. So I think a lot of things are not getting enough attention, more so now, certainly than a couple of years ago, which becomes an increasing challenge to keep a focus on the important work that's being done. So in the spirit of Judy just feeling she had to say that, I felt like I had to make that point, which is obvious to probably everyone on the call.
Yeah. Thanks, Ivan. Any other comments or reflections? Okay. Well, again, we'll share these slides out with you so that you have a chance to take a look. And thank you to those who were able to share their insights in the survey or today in the conversation. I think you'll see we'll try and be responsive in today's discussion and in future meetings to the themes that we heard in the survey and to both the opportunities and the challenges that people are raising. But it's nice to take a moment just to check in and hear how people are thinking about things. So thank you to those who took the time to do that. And so with that, I think we'll turn to one of the topics that has come up repeatedly in these meetings, both in the December meeting and in the survey, and that is the rising costs of living. So across Maine and in the country, many households and businesses are navigating the pressures of everyday costs, from energy and food to housing, healthcare, and the ability to save for life's bigger events. And the impacts of climate change and the actions we are taking to address them intersect with many of these pressures. We thought it was a good idea to take some time to explore that today. And so to help ground the conversation, we wanted to hear directly from some of the folks working across different parts of Maine's economy and with Maine communities, And so today's panelists each bring a different perspective, and we've asked them to share what trends they are seeing in their field, how those trends are affecting the people they work with, as well as their own households, and where climate impacts and action are showing up in those experiences. And so I'm very pleased to introduce today's panel. On the panel today, we have Greg Payne, who is a senior advisor for housing policy in GOPIF. Melissa Law, co-owner of Bumble Root Organic Farm and a Climate Council member. Kurt Brown, co-owner of Bold Coast Seafood and the Coastal and Marine Working Group co-chair. Ethan Tremblay, manager of planning and policy in the Maine Department of Energy Resources. Noelle Bonham, Maine State Director for AARP, Maine Climate Council member and an Equity Subcommittee co-chair, and Becca Boulos, Executive Director of the Maine Public Health Association and Community Resilience Working Group co-chair. So a huge thank you to all of you for helping to kick off this conversation today. What we'll do is I have a couple of questions that I'll ask each panelist, and then we'll have some time at the end for a larger conversation with the Climate Council members. So the first question for the panelists is, what changes or trends are shaping your sector in Maine right now? How do climate impacts and action intersect with those shifts? And so, Greg, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I guess overall, I'd say that the biggest trends that are driving things at this point in the housing sector is that we have a continuing increase in the demand for housing without a matching increase in the supply for housing. As we learned from a study that the administration and Maine Housing commissioned a few years ago, a lot of the folks who are coming in, we are obviously an in-migration state now. That's a big deal and helpful in many ways, but it's made it difficult and for various elements of infrastructure, including housing. And so the folks who are coming in tend to have slightly higher incomes than the folks who are already here. The overall impact of the increase in folks coming to Maine without, again, that offsetting or matching increase in supply is that costs go up. It's obviously just the way it works. That study that we commissioned a few years ago did conclude that we need about 80,000 or so additional housing units by 2030 in order to offset some of the lack of stock that's been built in the past, our historic underproduction, and to meet the needs of our future economy. So as we have struggled with these trends, rising demand, supply not rising adequately with it, the administration's single biggest focus has been on increasing the supply of housing units. And we're doing that in two ways. One is through significantly more investment in proven affordable housing programs with our partners at Maine Housing and our partners on the ground who build that housing. But in addition to those affordable housing units, we recognize of that 80,000 or so, most of the units we're going to need don't necessarily fall into that category of rent-restricted housing that Maine Housing produces with our partners. So the other element involves reducing some of the barriers that exist for the private sector to build the housing it's capable of building. So that is things like zoning and land use and permitting and regulations and the like. And so as we undertake this work of adding more housing units in the state through increased production and preservation of the units we have to be thoughtful about other things like protecting safety and supporting local government, but also of aligning with our climate goals. And so, I would, just as examples of that, a lot of the zoning and land use work that's happened at the legislature and within the administration over the past several years has been with this in mind, with the idea of focusing our development, our housing development in the places that local governments identify for themselves as designated growth areas or where there is water and sewer. So a lot of the bills that have passed in recent years that have been so promising are around minimum lot size provisions, where we're going to have designated growth areas and water and sewer, maybe 3-acre minimums don't make sense. And so there's various new laws around that that I think can be quite impactful. Certainly, that's part of all this. There's an affordable housing density bonus and new parking rules and a requirement to allow residential uses in commercial zones. All these things we see as really critical to helping the private sector do more of the housing work that it's capable of doing. In terms of affordable housing development, there certainly is a lot of things that happen at Maine Housing that align with the climate work that this group has been so involved with. That includes points for housing that gets built in areas that are service centers. It includes requiring electric systems and conduits for chargers, for EV chargers, and for PV panels and the like. Affordable housing that's developed through Maine Housing tends to be a little more efficient than the public's housing at large and our general requirements. The other last thing I'd mention is that one of the things we've heard loud and clear is that local government needs help. Their code enforcement officers, in particular, as they work with MUBEC and they work with folks who are trying to add housing units, they need additional technical assistance and guidance and support. And so that's part of the administration's focus in this current legislative session. And a lot of that is continuing to move forward through the budget and legislative processes right now. So I guess I'd end there and just say, as we work to increase supply, we just have to do it in a way that is smart and that aligns with these principles that the Climate Council have set out for all of us.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And I just would say to folks, if you have questions as we go along, just jot them down, and we'll sort of let each panelist have a chance to speak, and then we'll come back around for questions and conversations. So thank you, Greg. Melissa, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, thanks everyone. So my name is Melissa and I own and operate a small organic farm in Windham, Maine. So I'm coming to this conversation with the lens of a small business owner, a farmer, and a young mother who is trying to support her growing family. And I think that some of the trends we're seeing in the agricultural industry are just that the increasing cost of living is really affecting the labor market and our ability to attract and retain workers. And in such an important industry, we're growing food for our communities, but with rising housing costs, health insurance costs, fuel costs, it's really hard for people to get by on wages that farms have typically provided. And so at this time, that's really like the primary driver for growth in our business is how can we earn more money so that we can pay workers to work for us without making food prices unaffordable. And so it's just this balancing act of trying to um, in an industry with such tight profit margins, especially with the tariffs and increasing costs of materials and supplies, it's just really hard to continue to grow our business so that we can keep up with the cost of living that the labor market and that our workers and employees really need to get by. Um, and then, of course, farmers are always at the whim of the weather. That's just a part an inherent to our industry, but we've definitely been increasingly impacted by the uncertainty and unpredictability of the weather and the extremes that we've been experiencing. I mean, last year we had an incredibly wet spring. It impacted our ability to get into fields, to plant our crops. It impacted our early season sales. And then just a few months later, we were in the midst of a drought. And so these just extreme patterns are making it really hard for us to plan and prepare and keep our workers safe on really hot days. And so it's just kind of compounding the risks associated with growing food for our communities. So those are some of the patterns that I'm seeing and that our business and our industry seem to be grappling with at the moment.
Melissa, that is so challenging. Thank you very much for sharing that. Kurt, do you want to talk about what you're seeing in the marine sector?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I have to go after Melissa. That was really well said, and a lot of what she said, I will echo because we're seeing a lot of the same patterns in the marine realm. I'll speak to this from kind of a marine perspective generally with experience in the lobster sector. So in my mind, these changes really come down to affordability, which everyone has touched on so far, climate change, and then uncertainty as well. As far as affordability, I mean, there's short-term affordability. We've seen the price of bait continue to rise in recent years. We've seen the price of fuel continue to rise in recent years. And just over the last week alone, I shudder to think once our season gets ramped up in early summer, what fuel costs could be. It could be a real game changer for our industry, not only out on the water, but once our product is harvested hyper locally, it enters a global market, and so fuel plays a huge role in the price of lobster around our state and around the world as well. Help trying to find labor in coastal communities is very difficult for not just boats, but shoreside businesses as well. Insurance, and not just boat insurance, but health insurance costs going up as well. Every lobster boat is an owner operator operation, and they're on the hook for their own insurance. And I've talked to a lot of harvesters over the last 6 months who go without, and that has me very concerned. It may work in the short term, but it's a dangerous occupation that we're part of. And so hearing that more frequently than I have in the past is something that's definitely on my radar as someone who's part of this industry. Long-term housing, it's a real challenge for our industry. Coastal communities are seeing the impacts of what Greg talked about firsthand. And where we have such a hyper locally harvested product, basically you fish where you grow up. If you can't afford to live where you grew up, it changes the overall dynamics of our fishery dramatically. I think a lot of the conservation ethic that's present in our fishery is due to the local nature of fishing where you grew up. You're not going to cheat someone, because if you do out on the water, that's your neighbor. That's someone who you grew up with. That's someone you grew up admiring. And more we've seen the older generation kind of have to leave town more and more to stay a part of this industry and go further and further away from where they haul their traps, where they keep their boat. And that's going to have long-term implications for our industry for sure. And then as far as climate change goes, I'll touch on this in the next section, but we saw a warm Gulf of Maine for a good 10, 15 years, rapidly warming Gulf of Maine for a good 10, 15 years. The last 2 years, we've seen the opposite trend at depth, and it's just as much a climate change story as the warming. And it's really played an impact, or had an impact, on the timing of landings, and that has market implications as well, but I'll touch on that in the next section. And then, as Melissa said as well, uncertainty. We're a global industry. Our lobsters, once they reach the dock, could end up on a plate in one of the harbors right here in Maine within the next few days, or it could end up across the world in Shanghai or Guangzhou by the end of next week. And so tariffs, all the other implications that impact things globally definitely have played a role, and it's really hard to plan for the future when there's this much uncertainty in the business environment. So there's short-term changes that are absolutely impacting us. As far as challenges go, there's longer-term ones as well, and it's how we navigate that going forward that will determine how we do as an industry. But there's opportunities as well, and I'll talk to those in the next section. So thank you.
Great. Right, those are some really significant challenges, and I think really important for us to be thinking about. So thank you for sharing that. Ethan,
Sarah. Uh,
thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Ethan Tremblay. I'm with the Maine Department of Energy Resources, the state's new cabinet level agency, which was established last year to lead energy planning, policy, and development for the state. I'll start off in a similar vein to other folks. I think affordability is pretty clearly the central energy challenge that's facing Maine households in particular right now. It's the single biggest issue that we work on every day here at DOER. Um, at the same time, energy is only it's part of the bigger affordability puzzle. But it's a real part. I heard both Melissa and Kurt just now mention fuel costs several times, and so I think that sort of highlights how it's part of the puzzle. Not only energy costs directly for folks, but then energy is upstream of pretty much everything else in our economy at some point. So it manifests in higher transportation costs, which manifests in higher costs of goods and services. Costs that businesses pass along to consumers. Costs of healthcare. So energy is sort of key to all of those things. But when we kind of zoom in to the household's experience, energy itself is not a monolith. People don't pay one energy bill. They usually pay several energy bills. And we're seeing pressure on all of those right now. So just running down the list, electricity bills have several different components. There's supply. Most people know that as the standard offer. That's risen quite substantially and has been quite volatile over the past several years. That's mostly because we rely on fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, to generate our electricity in New England, and natural gas prices have been quite volatile. Most folks, about 2/3 of households in Maine, still pay a heating oil bill as well. Maybe not monthly, but whenever they have to top up the tank throughout the course of the winter. That's been really challenging. Obviously, it snowed on Sunday, and so winter doesn't necessarily agree with the first day of spring that might be on the calendar. But we are nearing the end of the heating season, which is really positive. That can't come soon enough for folks who've had to refill their tank in the past couple of weeks because heating oil has reached historic highs, and that's due to global disruption from what's happening in the Middle East right now. So Maine has been for decades and continues to be the most heating oil dependent state in the country. We've made historic progress in reducing that dependence in recent years, but too many folks are spending an extra, around $300 if they're filling their oil tank this month. That's on top of what they would have spent a month ago. That's heat. Lots of folks also heat with propane, either for their whole house or to supplement other sources. That's also gotten more expensive. Natural gas, which is available to some households in more densely populated parts of the state. Some folks have seen their bills double in the past month after severe storms. And then gasoline, of course, which is what most Mainers rely on for transportation fuel, has increased $1 a gallon almost in the past month. So that's kind of the affordability landscape, just in terms of cost pressures that folks are facing. I think a couple other trends that we're keeping our eye on. One is increasing electricity demand in particular. This is expected. We're early, right? But this is expected to happen across our state, and it's kind of a bigger trend that's happening across the country as well. Here in Maine, maybe somewhat distinct from much of the conversation that's happening nationally, that's primarily driven by electrification, mostly of heating, which is good. That's progress in deploying heat pumps, which I'll talk about more in a minute when we get to some manual made solutions. It's also driven by economic and population growth. Greg touched on folks, population growth and folks who want to live in Maine because it's a great place to be. But electricity demand growth it can be a challenge, but it's also a real opportunity. The grid is mostly a fixed asset, and so if we're able to better utilize it, if we add more usage without adding to the peak, then we can actually drive down the rates that folks pay by spreading those fixed costs across more users. And so we see that while it can be a challenge, we really see that primarily as an opportunity to improve grid utilization. Load growth is also, I mentioned, kind of a national trend. There's manufacturing, there's data center deployment, particularly in other parts of the country. We've seen a handful of early proposals here in Maine, but I think what I would highlight there is actually being more impactful is the overall growth in demand, particularly for natural gas to provide electricity for load growth across the country. Combined with increasing export capacity, the U.S. is projected to increase our liquefied natural gas, LNG export capacity by 60% by the end of the decade. means that we're likely to see, and this is reflected in including the Federal Energy Information Agency's forecasts, substantial increases in the cost of natural gas going forward, which will have impacts for Maine's economy because of that electricity generation reliance I mentioned earlier. Another trend is aging infrastructure. Time passes inexorably forward. There's also storm impacts that increasingly impact our energy infrastructure, and particularly the electricity grid. About $20 of the average person's CMP bill right now is going towards major storm recovery from the significant winter storms we experienced a couple years ago. The good news is that particular charge will soon be paid off, but we know that storms are getting more frequent and more severe. And so preparing our infrastructure and our communities and doing it in a way that is paced and ultimately helps with affordability is kind of a key challenge that we continue to work on. We're really excited that our utilities have developed their first ever integrated grid plans and climate change protection plans to really zero in on these opportunities and challenges in a transparent and rigorous way. But I think those are kind of several of the trends that are really, from an energy perspective, kind of contributing to the moment that we're in. I'll end on a hopeful note and then be happy to talk more in response to the second question. But Maine's energy economy employs a record high number of Maine people, more than 16,000. We have the fastest growing clean energy sector in the Northeast, and we contributes more than $3 billion to our economy annually. So I offer that just to say that doing this work and addressing these challenges is also an opportunity in itself. It's putting Maine people to work in high quality, family sustaining careers across the state.
Great. Thanks, Ethan. It's really helpful to hear you describe those trends. Thank you. Noelle, would you describe for us what you were seeing?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I get into the trends, I'd like to talk about the facts. Maine is the oldest state in the nation, both by median age, which is 45.1 for median age, and also by percentage of residents 65 and older, and that's 23% of the state's population. We also are the only state in the nation where residents age 65 and older outnumber those who are 18 and younger. And between 2019 and 2022, the 65 plus population grew by 6%, and it's projected to grow up to 35.6% by 2032. And so, I think the one takeaway from that conversation is that we have the oldest population, and that it is a fact. It's the way of life for us here in Maine, and I think keeping that at the forefront of our all other conversations, whether it has to do with housing, whether it has to do with healthcare, whether it has to do with transportation, I think it would help us significantly, because I think when you're talking about serving the largest part of the population, you're pretty much talking about serving everyone, when it comes to demographics. The one other fact is that the older adults, older Americans between the ages of 85 and 104 are projected to be the fastest growing age demographic of all age demographics over the next 20 to 30 years. So we are living a lot longer than our ancestors have. And so, having kind of stated those facts, the trends that we're seeing is that there's a decline in the workforce. We have seen that the working age population between 20 and 64, 65 is expected to decline by 4.6% by the time we get to 2032. And again, if you lay that over the fact that we're going to actually see a significant increase in that age demographic, we're also seeing a decline in the number of people working who are going to be working within that age demographic. Then 56% of Mainers 65 and older manage 4 or more chronic conditions, and most of these Mainers live in rural parts of the state. when we talk about the housing problem that we have in our state, most older adults are being driven out of their homes because they cannot either keep up with the increasing rents, or they're unable to pay the taxes as taxes are going up, as the values of their homes are going up, but they're not able to keep paying those increased taxes. Affordability, everyone's mentioned it, so I'll do my bit as well, adding to that conversation, to that bit. Older Mainers are directly impacted by all the cuts that we're seeing, all the changes that we're seeing to services, and therefore are impacted adversely, and also disproportionately, because for older adults, for someone who's in a younger age demographic, they may have time to kind of recover, or take on another part-time job to kind of make ends meet. Though I don't at all think that's okay. We should be able to provide salaries to our employees in a way that they can actually afford living in the state. But at least for a younger person, they're able to take on another job. But for an older adult that's living on a fixed income, it is really tough to kind of make ends meet, and they're having to make tough choices every day. Between, do I keep the heat going, for a little bit longer, or do I just turn it on in the evening after the sun has set, so that I can actually, stay warm when I need to stay warm, and I can somehow manage when it's slightly warmer during the day? Or should I split my medication so that I'm using half the dosage that I need to, so that I don't have to spend the same amount of money on my medication on a monthly basis, so I can save that to then pay for my energy cost, to pay for my electric bill? So these are tough decisions that older adults are facing, and when you talk, when you place that conversation, when you talk about economics and socioeconomic conditions of older adults within the context of climate change, most older adults are not, unfortunately, don't have the privilege or the luxury, or or the necessity even to think about climate change and the direct impact of climate change on their livelihoods, though it is impacting them directly or indirectly one way or the other. So that is also a truth out there, that for older adults, they're having to think about the basic needs. How am I going to make my ends meet on a daily basis, before they can think about the impact of climate change, and what can I do as an individual, as a citizen, as a responsible citizen, of the state, of this country, of this planet, to do my bit to really take on climate change as a serious issue that affects us all. So I'll leave it at that. And again, the two kind of major pieces are, the cost of living and the increased costs, and inflation impacting older adults directly. And the other aspect is they're unable to think about climate change and its impacts in a very direct manner, because they're having to deal with other real life issues that seem more prominent and more pressing in the moment.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those insights. Becca?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like everybody's talked about the public health challenges, so it's kind of funny to go last. Everything that everyone else has talked about are definitely public health issues. I guess when I think about the drivers of all those different public health challenges that other folks have discussed, I think about it a little bit more broadly, about some of the bigger systems changes that we've been seeing, and they're kind of concentrated in three macro areas. I would say that one is trust in public institutions. I think the second is around communications, and I think the third is around really large policy shifts. And we've certainly seen that, I think, just in the past year at the federal level. So again, I just make it really clear. It's not to say that there aren't other public health issues. I think everyone else has really laid out clearly the challenges with affordability and housing and energy and rural healthcare access. If I kind of take a step back, I think that what drives those issues are kind of in these larger systems areas. And so what we're seeing here in Maine, and I do think this is true from folks that I've talked with around the country, is this current of resistance to science-based policymaking. I think we see it with the anti-vaccine movement, with the anti-fluoridation movement, with attacks on public officials, and the spread at which misinformation goes on social media, with the explosion really of AI-driven content and policy making and policy debates that happen online, in kind of soundbite form. I think that feeds that anti-science movement and that distrust of public institutions, and it really contributes to the polarization that we're seeing and feeling, not just in Maine, but really around the US. And I think that polarization and that kind of more narrow focused policy making makes it harder for us to advance legislation that responds to the needs of people and that considers the different impacts that might happen in other sectors when we do pass policy. And an example of that, I really think, are some of the larger federal policy changes that have taken place over this past year that have had direct impacts to healthcare access and to public health services here in Maine and in other places. I think we saw that with the expanded ICE operations, the passage of HR 1 last summer, which changed eligibility criteria for different federal programs, and all of those, and other areas too. All of those have compounding impacts on our health and on the economy, which are also interconnected. And then to your second question around the intersectionality with climate change, as a public health person, I think everything is connected and intersectional. And very similarly, as we see more resistance to science-based policymaking and to government regulation, both from inside and outside of government, what we see is then less political will and less investment in the programs and the policies that we need to respond to a changing climate. The spread of misinformation about the causes of climate change really does perpetuate that scaling back. And then, the really big shifts like the EPA's repeal of the endangerment finding are going to drive up healthcare costs. So we're seeing again that intersectionality around climate, around environmental health, around our individual health and the economy. Like Ethan, I also want to end on a more positive note, because I think that we have a responsibility to respond and that there is a path forward. Just as one small example, and I'm happy to have gone after Noel, is that Maine AARP and Maine Public Health Association are collaborating on a series of community listening sessions around the state. And while they're more broadly focused about community health needs and priorities, at the first one we held in December, the major themes we heard were around sustainable communities, clean air, and community building. And all of those intersect with climate, with climate impacts and climate action. And so when I think about ways that we can restore trust in public institution, respond or be responsive, I guess, with our communication and advance good policies, it's with in-person gatherings like that where people can come together, they can build community, we can have discussion and really come together to address the public health needs of our various communities.
Becca, thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of our panelists. I mean, that really paints a very sobering picture of the trends that you're seeing right now. I do just want to remind Climate Council members, working group co-chairs, we're going to do one more question for our panelists, and then we'll have a chance to have any questions you might have for them, or a discussion about sort of what you've heard and what it makes you think about as we think about the implementation of Maine Won't Wait. So the second question for our panelists is, given what you described that you're seeing, what does this mean for how we implement the state's climate action plan going forward? So Greg, I'll go back to you.
Sure. Three quick things thinking about this and what happens going forward. One is that, obviously land use policy obviously really closely intertwines with these discussions about climate response. One of the other things that happens, though, in these conversations is it tends to get a little rocky in the where state policy ends and where local policy begins. And this question of local control can be a difficult one. That's going to continue to be one that we're going to need to wrestle with. There are some towns, obviously, that are more eager than others to help with creating the additional housing supply that we need as a state. But that's just one piece it is a challenge. It's going to continue to be a challenge. A second piece, I guess I'd call out is on costs. I mean, the cost of building housing has risen so exponentially. Labor costs are probably the single biggest driver of that, but supply costs, and there have been tariff issues as well, is another one. And I think one of the things that brings to the fore is that as we think about additional requirements that we might put, whether it's Maine housing, projects, or what we put in code and require of the private sector, we're going to have to be cognizant of the cost shocks that are already creating the problems we're having right now, where people say, I can't get a home for under X. The degree to which we're driving costs up with some of the things that make sense to do, but others might not see it as making sense. That's going to be an increasing issue I think we're going to have to reckon with, and being strategic about the things that we require, knowing that the more we require, we do have sometimes the problem of producing less units as a result. So that challenge will be there. And I guess the last one I would just put out, I know very little about the metrics of where this is going right now, but I think one of the things that we're trying to pay a little bit more attention to these days is climate migration and the degree to which that may happen sooner than we might have thought, especially while records are being set all across the South right now. How quickly might human beings decide that that's not livable and want to go to places where it is a little more livable? I think that is going to create a challenge for all of us in continuing to be really planful and focusing our development in the right places. So those are just three issues I guess I'd call out moving forward in addressing housing problems while we're addressing climate at the same time.
Great. Greg, thank you very much. Melissa, how are you thinking about implementation of Maine Won't Wait?
Yeah, so thanks everybody. In response to what Greg was just mentioning, I think that I am definitely thinking about the pressures of development on farmland, and one of our recommendations from Maine Won't Wait is to increase the amount of conserved land in the state, and with a focus on protection for farmland and working lands. And I think that that's going to be really critical as we do see potential climate migration and just the general development pressure we're seeing, especially on lands close to cities and the coast. And I think that that's where a lot of the healthy soils are, and Maine's prime farmland is. And so we're seeing so many farms go out of business or just make the decision to sell their land at market value because it's so hard to make a living as a farmer, and this is a better option. So I think that we definitely need to be putting more effort or continuing our efforts to protecting working lands. And I do think that in the face of so much uncertainty, community resilience is really key, and how we can build more robust communities where people are supporting one another, where food is being grown and supplied locally, so that when there are bigger market disruptions, we do have a level of resilience right here in our communities here in Maine. And so I think I'm excited about the Maine food plan, and trying to incentivize people to buy local food, whether that's through institutions or just encouraging people to get out to farmers markets with the Real Maine program. But again, yeah, just community resilience and the focus there really connects all the dots in such an important way.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Kurt, can I turn to you next?
Absolutely. Thank you. I'll throw out an anecdote that was positive over the last 2 years and very encouraging. One of the recommendations that came out of the Coastal and Marine Working Group was monitoring and the importance of keeping our finger on the pulse of what is happening out in the Gulf of Maine. And it was a little under 2 years ago that I went on to my favorite website, nearacoust.org, and looked at their ocean climate tool, which I do every day, and noticed that as we were getting into the summer 2 years ago, water temperature, especially at depth, wasn't warming up like it normally did. It was taking its sweet time. And I shared that information with another lobsterman, a good friend of mine, Chuck Bennett, who was also on the working group. And Chuck's a lot smarter than I am. And he was looking at not just water temperature, but he scrolled through the tabs and was looking at salinity as well, and noticed that the salinity of that colder water at depth was at all-time lows, which is kind of counterintuitive, given that you would expect lower salinity water to be closer to the surface and not at the bottom, given the density of lower salinity water. Chuck then went out and brought that to every scientist he could find, Damian Brady at UMaine, Nick Record at Bigelow, the list goes on and on and on. And it started this collaborative conversation about water temperatures in the Gulf of Maine and what the heck was going on, that culminated in a paper by Nick that I think was titled Beginning of a Cold Wave in the Gulf of Maine. And it was just a really fascinating collaborative process. And I think that's the power of collaborative research right there. Fishermen and scientists working together, sharing observations, and then trying to answer questions. And in my mind, that story has continued through last year with colder water kind of sticking around at depth. And yeah, it's really a climate change story. We had cold, low salinity water at depth in the Gulf of Maine. I'll let everybody on here guess where that probably is coming from. In my mind, it's probably coming from up north and is a direct result of climate change and meltwater and lower salinity water running off of glaciers and all that fun stuff. So a huge climate story playing out right here in the Gulf of Maine that was found by both scientists and fishermen working together. And since then, some organizations here within the state and the university and NOAA got a project funded to put temperature sensors on lobster traps and other fishing gear. And the response to that has been overwhelming. They can't get enough of them up here to go in those traps, which every time that trap is hauled, that temperature sensor somehow Bluetooths to a box on each boat and then goes up to the cloud somehow. And it gives harvesters and scientists real-time information on what's happening on the bottom and throughout the water column in the Gulf of Maine. Like, this is climate research happening between industry and science, and it's all spoken in the same language as long as everyone's talking Fahrenheit and not Celsius. But ultimately, it's just been really cool to see industry buy-in to climate science and everybody wanting to be a part of it. So trying to spin a positive aspect of this, that is one that I've seen over the last 2 years that's been really great. And I'll say hi to Becca, who's a fellow classmate of mine way back in the day at Cape Elizabeth High School, representing here on the Climate Council. Nice work, Becca.
Great story, Kurt. Thank you so much for that. Ethan.
Thanks. I think one thing that is exciting to me is to be able to say that when it comes to the energy space, a lot of what we need to do to tackle the affordability challenges that I just spent quite a while talking about also really helps build community resiliency, right? And really helps reduce emissions, and really in a lot of other ways is what I would say a good fit with Maine Won't Wait. And what I mean by that is that, we are seeing a lot of success deploying heat pumps in Maine, and heat pumps help save households money, right? But they also provide year-round comfort. They reduce reliance on those volatile imported fossil fuels that I was talking about. They help us better utilize the grid. So we can continue making that progress, right? We can continue to focus on other cost-effective ways to modernize the electricity grid. So including demand management, right? And again, getting it better utilization and efficiency. Deploying energy storage. DOER is actually advancing energy storage later this year with a competitive solicitation that we're excited about. We can continue to focus on driving down the costs of new infrastructure, not only to meet demand growth, but to improve resiliency, right? And being able to do that in a timely way helps make it something that we can do in an affordable way. So we can continue to engage communities in this work, right? With this grid planning work that's on the way. Our state energy plan is updated every 2 years. DOER will lead that work, and we'll launch that soon, and look for folks' feedback there. Um, other programs like a grid resilience grant program, which our office has administered, and is looking for additional funders. Additional funding is proposed for. So a lot of these efforts that whether they originate out of Maine Won't Wait or originate out of other initiatives that were on the way, like they really sort of are all pulling in the same direction. And the more we can kind of recognize that and share that and uplift it for folks, the more I think doesn't necessarily change how we implement Maine Won't Wait, but really underscores why we implement Maine Won't Wait. I want to say one other thing quickly, which is we hear from a lot of folks every day, particularly in the past month or so, about challenges paying bills, whether it's heating bills or electricity bills. There is assistance that's available. It might be near the end of the heating season, but it's not over, and it's not good for folks to be cold. And so I'd encourage people to reach out to their community action agency or to call our office, and we can help connect them with the resources that they need. There are resources available. So I just wanted to make sure everyone here was aware of that.
Great. Thanks, Ethan, for adding that. And maybe you or Hillary could drop a link in the chat for direction to some of those resources. That's important. Thank you. Noelle, do you want to talk about how what you're seeing influences how you're thinking about the implementation of Maine Won't Wait?
I think I kind of touched on it earlier, kind of very briefly, that I think in terms of implementation or the cross section of climate change itself and older adults, I think I'd call it the hotspot of vulnerability, because I think older adults, people with disabilities, are at the highest risk when it comes to the impact of climate change, and so it's particularly true in our state. With regards to, well, actually, let me do a little bit more background before I kind of summarize what the kind of day-to-day impacts might be. I think, with extreme heat, with extreme temperatures, in a state like Maine, which has historically been a kind of cool state that kind of Greg was referring to earlier about how people might be moving up here. But temperatures are rising here as well. And for older adults whose homes are not equipped to kind of, deal with such heat, it's a serious problem. We also know that, those folks who tend to be out in the, outdoors and working in the garden, and a lot of older adults do, vector-borne diseases are on the rise as well, just because of warmer temperatures. We're seeing that. We're also seeing an increase in kind of respiratory issues, and because of air quality as well. And that's another issue for an older adult whose health is already compromised, and they're having to deal with climate related health conditions that are adding to whatever they might be dealing with on the health front already. Housing inefficiency, I mentioned that already. Then the disruption of care. We saw during the 2023 storms, kind of what we were calling the monster storms, that a lot of communities were isolated, and older adults and people who really needed health care, there was no way they could access that. And if they were out of their prescription drugs, they couldn't get a refill. Even getting that refill for your prescription drugs is so basic, one might imagine. But if you have no way to if you're completely disconnected, there's simply no way for you to be able to access that. And then social isolation is a really huge problem among older adults, particularly in counties like Franklin County and Washington County, where there are higher concentrations of older adults living alone, and and in a serious storm, they may not even receive the warnings, of something coming their way. If they're not, if they're not on social media, if they're not on what are emerging to be, common ways that people get their information, emergency information, and so on and so forth. So in terms of the direct implementation, unfortunately for a lot of older adults, they are unable to really think about the impact of climate change, and they're unable to think about how they could participate in the implementation of the climate plan, which is sad, very sad, but it is the reality. And as older adults, I think there's again, there are the couple of factors that I think I need to mention here is an older adult who's living in a rural part of the state, an older adult who's already experiencing social isolation, and the reality is very different from an older adult who's living in a more populated area within the state, like Bangor or Lewiston or Portland, or are living close to family. That also has a huge impact. But with some of the challenges that have been mentioned by the earlier panelists, people are moving. They're not staying where they used to stay before, where they grew up, for economic opportunities, because they have to really, do something or move to find, employment or business opportunities that support their families, as there may be a growing family. And so that is another impact, I think, in terms of, that prevents older adults from really engaging in the implementation of the climate plan. And I think a significant thing that could help, an approach that could significantly help in this regard, is education, and meeting older adults where they are, and helping them, kind of engage within the conversation of climate change, and help them participate in the implementation of the climate plan in a way that is reasonable, that's realistic, and also helping them to be able to participate wherever they are to the extent they can. And just, yeah, I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Noel. And Becca.
Hi, Kurt. Great. I would say that great minds really do think alike, and that when I think about what we need to really be prioritizing as we implement Maine Won't Wait is uplifting examples of either new partnerships or, policies that we've passed that are really helping people. And I'm very genuinely sorry to be a broken record about this, especially to Judy and to Hillary, but I really think we need to be talking more about LD1. I love that bill. I thought it was a huge win for a lot of reasons, and I just think it needs to be shared more widely. And for those that are listening in and don't know about that bill, let me tell you about it. So it was titled An Act to Increase Storm Preparedness for Maine's Communities, Homes, and Infrastructure. And one of the reasons I really like this bill was because even though it was the governor's bill, it was bipartisan. So it had support from House and Senate leadership in both parties. And that's not a small feat. And I think that is something really to be celebrated, and that the contents of the bill came from the work of this body, and not just us as people who serve on it, but the people that we interacted with in our work. So in a council-sponsored listening session down east, some of the feedback they heard was that folks were more concerned about housing, which we're talking about childcare, about transportation, these other determinants of their health, more than they were concerned about specifically climate change, even though they're connected. That wasn't what was on the top of their mind. And then the Infrastructure Resilience Commission, had visited various parts of the state after those two back-to-back storms that we had, and it was clear that we needed to invest in our housing stock. And then in our resilience working group discussions, we also had a lot of discussions about that, about looking at how do we support people to help make their homes more resilient to the increasingly frequent and extreme weather events that we were experiencing. From a public health perspective, we know that homes with older roofs in need of replacement, or leaky basements, or poor flashing around the windows and doors, that invites water damage and mold growth and poor air quality, and can make a home inhospitable for people to stay in. So how do we prevent homes from falling into disrepair so that people can stay in them and not contribute to our housing crisis or force people to stay in an unsafe house. And so when I think about LD1, I think about that being a direct response to community feedback, to community engagement, with the work of the commission, to deliberations in our working group. And I just, it's a housing bill, but it's also a climate bill. And I really think that, people showed up, they engaged with our work. And I think we have to let them know that we listened, we heard them, we deliberated really good policy, and we passed something that is going to help people shore up their homes, to make them safer, to make them more resilient to climate change. And we saw that with the climate core. There have been other policies that we've passed too. And I just, as we keep advancing the work of Maine Won't Wait, I think it's imperative that we keep doing that. It's imperative that we keep listening. It's imperative that we keep responding, and that we close that loop and let people know that we heard them. And just kind of going back to what I brought up in the first question, I think that helps restore trust in public institutions. I think it helps improve our communications, and I think it helps advance good public health policies that respond to community needs. So I'll get off my LD1 soapbox now, but that's my response.
Becca, thank you so much for highlighting that. I think that's a great story. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for sharing those really compelling insights and thoughts as we think about implementing Maine Won't Wait in 2026. Those were really great stories and insights that you shared. We do have a few minutes to open it up to conversation with the council. So if folks have questions they jotted down for the panelists, or thoughts on sort of reflecting on what you heard, what you think this means for how we implement Maine Won't Wait moving forward, I'd love to hear from Climate Council members.
Make a couple comments, Sarah.
Thanks, Luke. Please go ahead.
So just to maybe mirror off Greg a little bit about, I've been in a lot of meetings in the last several months about housing and housing in Northern Maine and development in Northern Maine. And I actually heard somebody tell me today that developers are chomping at the bit to develop in Northern Maine. And my door's wide open for that. So anytime they're ready to come, I'm there. I'm ready for them. But Greg mentioned municipal guidance and in helping guide municipalities. And I just want to stress how valuable that is, that our capacities in most of our municipalities are very low. And although we are assumed to have knowledge of every topic in the Encyclopedia Britannica, most of our town managers don't have that. And so it can be a very big struggle. And so even when there is funding out there for us to navigate like a big housing project, we oftentimes need the guidance as much as we need the funding. And the funding is great, but the guidance we're able to use that guidance from project to project to project. So it's an education piece that is invaluable. It's something that we can use to repeat one project to the next. So just to comment on that. And just on Noel, every time Noel speaks, I swear to God, I take a page and a half of notes. Like, he always provides such valuable details and information. Like, I'm always thinking when he's talking about how, Aroostook County has an even higher age medium than the state of Maine, and Van Buren that I live in is even higher than that. And so that provides unique struggles for a small municipality like mine and a lot of the small ones that revolve around mine. And then just a quick comment about Melissa, information from Melissa about, reducing some sprawl and fearing about farmland. There's organizations like Strong Towns that are constantly talking about how we have killed our communities with sprawl, and that financially it would have been smarter to build up and not out. And we may have to start thinking about that. I mean, that may be part of what we have to consider when it comes to housing, is building a little taller and less wide. That might be what we need to do. We're surrounded by farmland. in Aroostook County. We can't just build on all of it. We can't. And so small projects like community gardens, like Van Buren's community garden, we're actually produced so much food in our community garden last year that we didn't know what to do with it as individual farmers, like 10 farmers. And some of it went to waste, I hate to say. And, maybe some of the funding from the community action grant, if people, use some of those funds to put into practice, into building these types of, community growing places like we have built, maybe that would help some of the costs of the food. And we actually are installing a farm stand this year that all our extra growing food will go into that farm stand for people to take for free. And then just my last comment, and I'll get off, is about innovation. And Maine used to be just so full of innovators. There's so many things that were invented by Maine people. The frozen French fry, just tons of things that you wouldn't know. And I think that if we're gonna, when we talk about housing, we're talking about all these things, we have to start thinking about how to innovatively build these new housing projects so that they use less energy, they use less fuel, they use less water, they use less wastewater. We have to it has to be more than just building a building. There has to be a lot more innovation that is occurring in Maine to help make this process, even better, I think. So that's my take on today. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Other comments or reflections as you think about implementing Maine Won't Wait in the year ahead? Yeah, Judy.
One of the things that we're working on in the NOAA grant that has finally gone out to RFP and is on the street now is a hub for quickly finding the resources that you need for resilience. And we've combined it, we in that sentence is myself and Hannah Silverfine, with an online risk data portal. So it makes it a more complicated RFP, but hopefully we'll get some great Maine innovators to divine some great websites for us. And I mention it in this context because of the fact that it's resilience focused, but also to pick up on what Luke said. I know that Samantha at MoCA is also considering, and I was working on it today, adding sort of a module to this notion of being able to get technical assistance sort of at your fingertips according to your needs, according to your geography, according to your specific area of interest, and being able to wade through, because there are lots of good resources out there. It's the issue is finding them, and finding them at the level and the scale and the entry point that you have and your need for them. So that is being worked on from the point of view of resilience, but also in the larger technical assistance field across zoning, planning, housing, subdivision, infrastructure, and so on. So those things are in the works, and I think are part and parcel of both what Maine Won't Wait has contributed, and frankly, with the legacy of this administration, if you will, in terms of reorganizing state government agencies to a service orientation to municipalities. And that's what we had in mind with the creation of MoCA all along. So I think it's happening, and that feels good.
Thank you, Judy. Any other comments, questions, or reflections?
I guess I'll just weigh in here for a minute. It's interesting. I think 4 or 5 of us who are on here today were also talking about making Maine development ready through another committee and work that we're all doing together. And I thought I'd mention one of the recommendations that was discussed yesterday was the idea of aligning our policies and our priorities across the work that we're doing in state government. And it's been really interesting to listen to this conversation today. And, so many of the things that the panelists were talking about are exactly the same things that we're talking about with that committee as well. And so maybe something we want to think about as we're looking at our work in the year ahead is, doing exactly that. What was recommended is making sure that we have that alignment across all the efforts that we're undertaking in state government, because there are a lot of places where we're all involved and working on so many of the same things, and have an opportunity to feed that into the recommendations in our next planning cycle for the Maine Climate Council as well.
Thank you, Melanie. Okay, well, with that, I just want to give another huge thank you to our panelists. That was a really excellent presentation. So thank you all for taking the time to think about those questions and share your thoughts and your insights with all of us. And with that, Melanie, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about communications.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Sorry, everybody. I wasn't able to be here when we got started earlier. I was hopefully finishing my time with the legislature for this session. But I was able to get in time to hear the panel, which was great. And as Sarah said, thank you so much for all of your contributions. I think one theme that keeps coming up is how we talk about climate change, and we talk about the work of the plan and how the actions in the plan can help many of the challenges that are facing Mainers right now. And I am really excited to be able to introduce a local celebrity from Maine who has been willing to join us today to talk about climate communications. So I would like to introduce Keith Carson, the Director of Environment and Science Communications at Maine Conservation Voters. And some of you may know of him as a former TV meteorologist. And so, Kevin, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Now, we'll have the opportunity for a lot of folks to weigh in here potentially, but I have some questions for you to get things started. So first, Kevin, what is your sense of the public perception of climate change and climate work in Maine?
Sure. So
Keith, sorry.
yeah, no, it's okay. That's if you're gonna get the name wrong, that's the one that everybody does. Thank you for having me. First of all, and actually the panel was very, very interesting. And I heard some of the same themes that maybe I'm going to talk about here. I think Maine is doing well overall. So let's start there. Like this is a positive thing. I think that obviously heat pumps are a huge success story that we talk about all the time. And I think Maine is a pliable state, a state that can move off its mark. It's not so heavily partisan in one direction that we can't make progress. So I think we've had several good years of making progress on a couple of fronts. However, obviously we have huge headwinds, and I think that has trickled down to the state level where things that were maybe in vogue, you see companies, larger companies, who jumped onto some of this climate action, partially for their own purposes, have backed off that. And so we do have some headwinds here going forward as far as people's participation, how comfortable they are, participating in climate-related action. And also, this may seem silly, we just had a cold winter. And that is always a challenge when we communicate climate change, to have weather that is on the ground for people cold. So that may seem like a small factor, but it's something that over the last few months has been something we've had to message directly.
So given the headwinds that we have and sort of a changing landscape at the federal level, and that influencing the way the public is perceiving climate change and its impacts in Maine, what's your sense of the messages that resonate sort of across time, right? Like, what are those resilient messages that stick with people, and that make a difference to them regardless of those headwinds that we're dealing with?
Yeah, I think so. I think we'll talk about messages that I think that work. But one thing I wanted to bring up, because I didn't hear it yet, is the power of repetition. Just you'll see it on opponents of clean energy. There are people who every day will post about how solar is why your CMP bill is high. So every day, and I think sometimes in the climate space or in the clean energy space, all of these spaces, we spend a lot of time trying to get the message exactly right, but at the same time, a counter message has already gone out there 4, 5, 6 times, and there is just a lot of power to repetition, whether or not it's a good thing. A lot of people are repeating things that are not true. But I think one of the things for me about messages that stick is making them stick, making them repetitive. And they don't have to be simple. I don't subscribe to the fact that people can't, reason and understand these topics, but I do think themes have to come up over and over again. So for me, one of those is um, it's really simple, but it's the idea that the climate has changed before is what you're going to hear a lot in the last 10 years or so. Um, and I have a couple of just quick little talking points that involve um, how we measure incoming solar radiation. Also, carbon isotopes, how we know that the carbon in the atmosphere that has been brought into the atmosphere is from fossil fuels. And then I revisit greenhouse gases because there's a lot of science nerds out there, but for most everyone else, they talked about the greenhouse effect in 7th or 8th grade and then left it there. So so there's a power to coming back to these simpler topics so that you can set the stage for the message. So I think that's big. And as you know, I think everyone here knows right now, the biggest thing is that we are now at a point where we can say that solar and onshore wind are per megawatt the cheapest form of electricity in the United States. And if you go and talk to somebody in Skowhegan right now, they're not going to know that. So that's the message that resonates when I talk to people about it, and we have to keep repeating.
Um, how is the way that we're talking about climate change in Maine different or similar to the way it's being discussed at the national level? And do you have any recommendations for us in terms of what you're seeing with national level messaging that we should be keeping in mind as we're communicating with Mainers?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some similarities. Some states, have the national message can be similar, but I would say ours can be more positive because we are still moving in that direction here at the state level. And although we talk about it internally, I don't think there's a lot of value in talking about the external headwinds that are going on at the federal level. Unless it's to draw attention to things that just don't pass the sniff test. I mean, there's been a few cases where there's money being spent to just stop electricity from coming online. And I think if that happens in Maine, that's worth talking about. But no, I think it goes back to Mainers are a little, in my experience, I'm from Massachusetts originally, don't hold that against me. And I've lived in Georgia and other places. And I think Mainers are more open-minded. They're willing to be someone who maybe doesn't agree with you ideologically on several issues, but maybe can understand why we should try to do a little bit more for renewable energy so that drives down costs and we don't have as much dependence on foreign oil. So I think it's really that we don't have to be as um, pointed and maybe as divisive to move the needle at Maine than maybe, if you were trying to communicate this at a national scale.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Well, and I think it mirrors some of what Becca had highlighted earlier too about how we should be doing more to hold up some of the successes, the achievements that we've had, the good work that's been implemented, and things we've accomplished implementing some of the council's recommendations in Maine. So along those lines, although you're from away, which we will forgive you. Some of the rest of us here might be too. What could we do to build more trust and credibility with the people of Maine when they hear of the work of Maine Won't Wait, the plan, the council and the things that the government is initiating and that we're doing through partnerships. How do we have the public have more trust, and particularly when we talk about the science too, to believe in the science that the Science and Technical Subcommittee has been making available on a regular basis and updating?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember which panelist said this, but certainly it is a big challenge that um, government sources of information are not seen the way that they used to be. I mean, and that is difficult. I've even linked to reports. I think that when the Brattle group did a report recently on the cost of electricity in Maine, there was a lot of people when I tried to message this on social media were like, yeah, but it's funded by the state of Maine, therefore we don't. So there's a certain group that you're going to have to probably just consider that part a lost cause. But I do think the science, the communication of the science, if it can be broken down into digestible pieces, I think that's really important, because it seems like there's this level where there's this super simple messaging of humans are causing climate change. 99% of climate scientists agree. And then there's this um, chasm where the next thing is peer-reviewed science papers and long reports on it. Even if there's executive summaries in there, they're pretty dense for most people. So I think if anything, it would be bridging that. Like I would love to see, and I do have Maine Won't Wait down on my it's like a coffee, the coffee table, and I can't recall, but like if you had 4 or 5 bullet points of how we know it's humans, that's how I've approached it when I used to work in television, and really here when I do talks for Maine conservation voters too. And I think it's pretty effective. I mean, if somebody comes in a complete skeptic, it's going to be a little hard. But for people who really think, hey, the climate's changed before, how do we know it's us? I found a 4 or 5 point digestible approach, if it's on one page or one slide or whatever it may be, can be really helpful, because we all see a ton of information all the time. So distilling it can help.
Awesome. That's really helpful. And I think aligns with some of the work that Ivan and others on the Science and Technical Subcommittee have been trying to do with this year's update to their analysis that they'll be coming out with. So if he's having any trouble convincing the other scientists on the group, hopefully they'll be listening to the recommendation you just made. And apologies again for the name mess up. I hope you know I work with a meteorologist named Kevin. And so fortunately, my brain was conflating those two things.
No
So
worries.
I would like to give the folks on the council now an opportunity if they have any questions for you. I know we're maybe all a little quiet this afternoon, but hopefully some of you have some things you'd like to ask Keith as well. Ivan.
Yeah, thanks, Keith, for those comments, and you do a great job at communicating a lot of the science and the politics around climate change in general. I did catch your game show, by the way. I think it was on Facebook or something that went by, and so if folks haven't caught that, they should do so. But I raised that because it I think it carries a point. It was funny, and I knew it was you, so I stopped and looked at it. What was that about? Um, but you came away from that with a clear message on the costs of renewable energy and onshore wind and solar. You couldn't help but walk away from that, maybe chuckling, maybe for folks that don't know you saying, who is this nut? But they would know what your message was in that regard. And what, not that you're a nut, of course, but in a lot of the communications, particularly around adaptation, um, I think about but don't accomplish very much in that regard, having to do with the cost efficiency of a lot of what we're doing. And that example in renewable energy is kind of a slam dunk, despite what the opposing narrative is, which is repeated over and over again, as you point out. But there's a lot of research now that is able to point to, how cost effective a whole bunch of things that we do in the climate space is. So I guess my question is, how can we do a better job of that kind of messaging beyond just the energy sector? And how important is it, do you think, in order to break through to make the economic argument?
Yeah, well, first of all, I am a nut, and that's totally fine. That doesn't bother me at all. I think I think humor is really important. I mean, my whole career in broadcast, I was like a tick off. I was like, people didn't know what I was going to say, but I think they got it because when it came down to it, I knew the topic, and I think it's similar here, where using some levity when you can to get the point across is important because climate change is it's a heavy topic, and it's been messaged in a heavy way for a while, which I completely understand why, but I think maybe people have become tone deaf to it, the more doomsday aspect of it. So if we can get points across in a little bit lighter of a manner, then I think we should. Now, it's a slightly different situation. I don't know how you would do that exactly at like the government level, for example, although I've seen some pretty funny like Instagram accounts run by government entities, but I do think making it fun can help a lot, and you come away with it. And one of the greatest successes from that silly video was, I'd have to check, I don't think anybody argued the point in the comments, which is unheard of. Like nobody said, no, I don't think solar or wind is actually the cheapest. So they laughed, moved on, commented, but we got something through there. So yeah, I think humor when you can, some sort of lightness is really helpful. I'm seeing a comment. Did you want me to just pick that up from the chat, Melanie, or
Sure, if you want to go ahead while some of the other members might be thinking about some questions.
can everybody read that or should I?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, yep. It says, I'd love to know what local climate related stories Keith thinks have been overlooked by Maine's mainstream media, or how we could be doing better. Yeah, I I don't know what's been overlooked. I think sometimes, so when I worked at a TV station, the biggest challenge I felt was that sometimes, day turn reporters were being asked to get into a really dense topic. So a perfect example is when I was still there, there was a talk about how much is net energy billing adding to our the average Mainer's bill. And so that's tasked to someone at 9 in the morning, and they expect it to be done by 4 in the afternoon. And I think without my help, where I said, this is true, this part is true. However, please note that natural gas variation is a much larger portion of the increase of a CMP bill. So I think without people that help background, it's more about the time they have to research a story to get it correct in these really kind of dense fields. And I also think journalism has taught us. I have a minor, an associate's in journalism, and one of the things they harped on, right, was both sides of the story. The challenge with that is sometimes only one side of the story is factually correct, and so sometimes reporters, whether it be TV or print, will make a very strong effort to reach out to kind of both sides of an issue, but what the result of that is one person is saying something that's factual and the other person is saying something that is not factual, but we are made kind of to show both sides. So I don't know about any specific stories, Penelope, but more just the time necessary to research it properly to put it in the context.
That's great. And I think, Jay just highlighted some of the benefits that they've seen from work that they've done up in northern Maine. And similar to, again, what Becca and others had said about, taking the opportunity to uplift the successes and the benefits of the work that's been done. Also goes back to the point you made, Keith, about, focusing more on the positive as well. There are other questions from council members?
I'll try this one out loud, Melanie. I was sort of
Yeah.
starting to type it, but I thought I'll just say it out loud. Um, Keith, one of the things that you may have seen that Susie Arnold presented really well is the science of hope and uh, the sense that if you've got some sense of agency in doing something about the situation that we find ourselves in, that it can make a difference. I think especially for young people. And I'm wondering if that plays into your communication methods in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely. So I have like a small presentation of kind of climate communication things I don't like, and one of them is this idea that, for example, one of them is we've reached the tipping point. So the idea that like we can't, because of how long this CO2 is going to stay in our atmosphere, that we're going to be several degrees Celsius warmer no matter what we do. And I say, well, then why do people want to do anything, right? This idea that you're already at this point, I think, doesn't spur any action. And I think the hope is it is important, and it's important in two completely different demographics. I think younger people really like to think about how they can affect change and make the earth better for themselves. And it also seems to resonate with older people when they're thinking about the next generations. So I think those are the spots where hope that we can do things to actually impact our climate in a positive way, and also hope that we can evolve and what for the damage that we've already done, we can be resilient. I think that's all important, because if people feel like there's nothing they can do, then that kind of the story writes itself as to what kind of actions they're going to be willing to take to in their life to change things.
Are there any other questions from council members? Ken, I don't know if you want to speak up. You just drop something in the chat for everybody if there's any further comment you want to make about that. Ken?
Thank you, Melanie. I'm in transit, so I hope my audio is coming through okay.
You're good.
I was just going to reinforce Keith's point about Caribou's and others about Caribou's utilities district experience. The power markets are very price sensitive. So when solar is available, it reduces the total that the state has to purchase for everybody else from markets. That means the price declines as opposed to being higher, and that means everyone benefits. That's the part of solar. It's called DRIPE, demand reduction induced price effects, that foes of net energy billing never understand and never include in their calculus. I did have a separate question for Keith, and that relates to the idea that the cost of climate change, whether they're civic infrastructure or public health or all sorts of other damages that storms and extreme weather, greater invasives and so forth perpetrate on our civilization. Should we concentrate it all on that side of the coin in our communications? If we don't act, there will be greater costs. It may be too obscure to really reduce the useful and effective sound bites. That's my fear. Thanks.
Yeah, well, good point, Ken. First of all, on the load demand at solar, and I've started getting into messaging real-time grid statistics, but I don't use ISO New England's site. I use a site that shows the behind the meter solar also, because then that way we get an accurate portrayal of how many houses are not needing grid production of electricity because of their solar panels. As far as the second question goes, I have experimented with that message, but I will say that I'm pretty broad when I do it. So I talk about, I just try to balance the conversation where some opponents feel like the costs of what we need to do to slow down climate change is too high. And I try to balance that by saying, okay, but think about the infrastructure that we need to change if we're going to allow this to continue. And I like to focus specifically on how many major cities are near bodies of water, for example, and what the real estate value is that is right near or just above sea level. So I do it in a less dense way, but I've definitely talked about there's not just one side to this coin. There's going to be a lot of money that we need to spend to adapt to this if we let this continue to run out of control. So I do think there's some value in that message. I tend to tune messages a little bit based on whom I'm talking to as well, of course. So that's what I would say is a good Rotary Club message. You know, is it's just like more of a business oriented type message.
Anybody else? All right. Well, Keith, thank you so much for taking the time with us this afternoon. It was really helpful. Your perspective is a great one to add to this conversation, and we're grateful that you're willing to spend an afternoon with us to have this conversation. And also thank you to panelists and all of you who weighed in this afternoon. I think this is a good conversation to keep moving on our way forward as we make plans for what we want to focus on for priorities in 2026. So maybe if we next want to just wrap up with a bit of conversation about what happens now, what our next steps are going to be. So this is, again, as we said, just the start of the work we're going to be doing this year. And we're looking forward to building on the discussions that we had today. We are going to be having our next meeting. It will be in person, June 16th at the Augusta Civic Center. And we are hoping to see Climate Council members and working group members. So everybody is invited for that afternoon of June 16th. I think you should all have an invitation already on your calendars from Hillary, hopefully. So you'll have that marked for you. In the meanwhile, between now and then, there are several important pieces of work underway that we're going to be looking forward to having in hand to further our discussions. This April, we are looking forward to the report from the Science and Technical Subcommittee, their interim report, which I think we discussed a little bit today. We are also hoping to get out from DEP the biennial report on progress towards our greenhouse gas reduction goals. Unfortunately, there have been some delays developing that this year. Usually we put it out at the beginning of the year, but we use a federal model that EPA used to populate for us, and they are not doing that this year. So fortunately, the Climate Alliance and a university are working on making that available to all the states. We're hoping to have that soon and then be able to get that report out probably by this summer. In addition to those reports, GOPIF is launching 2 analyses that will support the council's work. The first is a study on resilience funding and finance. The RFP for that is currently open. This initiative will review the resilience priorities identified in Maine Won't Wait and by the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission, and will explore new opportunities to fund and finance them. And then we're also expecting to release an RFP for an economic analysis of climate risk and resilience for the state in the coming months. And then just lastly, wrapping up, I'd like to thank everybody for your time this afternoon. Thank you for continuing to contribute to the work of the Climate Council. We are halfway through almost our 4-year planning cycle, which seems like a long time, but it means that we're going to start getting back to work and start doing the hard work with our working groups, evaluating the progress we've made and thinking about what we want to focus on this year. So Sarah, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, thanks, Melanie. I would say thank you again to our panelists and to Keith Carson for joining us. Really appreciate all of your contributions today. Great to see members of the Climate Council and the co-chairs. And I hope that folks will take the opportunity to join us in person in June. I think it'll be a really important meeting and looking forward to the chance to get together in person again. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.